Un aplauso para Pankaj Mishra, por favor. Su libro El mundo después de Gaza ha levantado ampollas. Es un tema incómodo para muchos. De hecho, partió de una conferencia que usted no pudo dar, se canceló, ¿verdad?
That's right. Gracias por venir especialmente con este calor.
Thank you for being here with this heat.
No voy a decir más
I'm not
porque
going to say more
no sé hablar bien.
because I really don't
Bueno,
know.
algo es algo, algo es algo.
Something is something.
But really, thank you for coming. I have to first say how grateful and relieved I am to be here in Madrid, coming here from London, where we've just seen an extraordinary spectacle of two leaders of the world's oldest so-called advanced democracies, both engaged in massive crackdowns on freedom of speech, on political protests. So to come from there, to come to a country where people are keeping alive the idea of moral conscience and intellectual conscience, expressing their moral passion against brute power, doing it consistently, openly. So I think, I do not exaggerate when I say that Spain has become the intellectual conscience of the world today. And I think a lot of people I know feel that way. So it's especially really uplifting for me to be here and to be engaged in this conversation. To answer your question, thank you. The book really did start off as a lecture, which I was supposed to give at the Barbican in London, a very big event space. Some of you may know of it. And the lecture was under a series, winter lectures, that are organized by the London Review of Books. And very close to the day when I was supposed to give the lecture, I was informed that the lecture had been cancelled because there were some fears about what I might say. So I think this is early 2024, so a few weeks into the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. People were already censoring themselves and other people. So I think the lecture and this book really was written with a sense of urgency that if some of us at least don't make the effort to make sense of what is happening right now and make it available to a wider audience, the current mainstream press as it exists and mainstream institutions in England and America, in the English-speaking world, are not going to let the truth come out. They're going to keep suppressing that. Fortunately, it's still possible to write a book and to be published, and for that to be read. I don't know how long this state of affairs will last, but I think this book was really certainly written out of a great sense of urgency, and then it was also written during a time when so many of us felt we were all going mad, watching this slaughter on a daily basis, watching these images from Gaza, and then realizing that not only are our political leaders not doing anything about it, they're actually cracking down brutally on people who are expressing the mildest dissent or the mildest opposition. So I think it was really unlike any other book that I've written in the past, written really out of an inner compulsion and, a desire to not go mad myself, and to deal with this pathology through making sentences, through making meaning, which is something perhaps writers can do faced with a situation like this.
El libro se titula, como decía, El mundo después de Gaza, pero buena parte de sus páginas están dedicadas a explorar el pasado, a contar cómo es posible que hayamos llegado hasta este lugar tan inconcebible, ¿no? Hasta este intento de aniquilación de Gaza, hasta esa impunidad con la que actúa Israel. En las últimas décadas, usted dice, han sucedido muchas cosas en el mundo. Han sucedido catástrofes naturales, crisis financieras, una pandemia, terremotos políticos, guerras. Pero usted dice, nada es comparable a lo de Gaza. ¿Por qué?
I think there are many reasons for this. One is that, the post-war world, post-1945, was built on certain guarantees by the victorious powers. The United States, United Kingdom, France, that the kind of monstrous crimes that we saw in the first half of the 20th century, we need to create institutions, we need to create organizations and have some norms and rules in place that we don't repeat this horrific episode in modern history. So in many ways, these allied powers, as they used to be called, created the post-war moral order, as it were. When those very same countries participate, enable, arm, support a genocide, while cracking down, while destroying sometimes their own most prestigious institutions, whether it's Harvard University or Columbia University, in order to suppress criticism of the country that's committing genocide, I think we are looking at a different scale of atrocity altogether. There are people who constantly say, why are you not interested in why are you not writing a book about Sudan? Why are you not writing a book about Myanmar and various other places where horrific atrocities are happening as we speak? And I think the clearest answer is that the political leaders of Western democracies, the most prestigious newspapers and periodicals in these countries, are not supporting these atrocities in Sudan and Myanmar. So I think what is happening today is something quite unprecedented. And I think the other reason why this is, singular, is that no mass atrocity, no mass extermination in the past has been so extensively televised. At no other point in human history have human beings been exposed to such extreme atrocity on a daily basis. I think psychologists, sociologists will in the future have to measure the enormous injury, the enormous damage that has been done to our minds and souls by this constant exposure to mothers grieving their children, of the corpses of children being blown apart on a daily basis. I don't think we've ever lived like this, with atrocity constantly streaming from our telephones. So I think in a variety, and these are only two of the ways that I should mention here, in a variety of ways, Gaza, the atrocity of Gaza, the destruction of Gaza, is an unprecedented event.
Esto es lo que Karl Jaspers calificaba de culpa metafísica. esa aflicción que experimentan quienes son conscientes de su impotencia ante una barbarie inconcebible en su entorno. ¿Estamos ahí? ¿Es lo que nos está pasando a nosotros?
It is, and I think on a different, in a much more extensive way, because if you remember in previous atrocities, people, let's say, the Holocaust, we weren't so informed of events that were happening in different parts of the world back then, or even much later, 2 decades later, 3 decades later. We came to know of things happening through our daily newspaper that arrived, in the morning, and reported on events that had happened the previous day, or you would hear this on the radio. But at no stage were we members of this instantaneous international community where it's impossible to escape a feeling of responsibility, a feeling of implication in various atrocities around the world. So this is something, quite unique in history, that thanks to communications, thanks to digital technology, we all are implicated, or at least we feel ourselves implicated in various events around the world. I mean, one reason why people here in this country, thousands of miles away from the Middle East, are rising in protest against what is happening in Palestine, because there is this feeling of implication, there is this feeling of metaphysical guilt, and that guilt, which is a term coined by Karl Jaspers, but he was writing at a time when, again, people were not so exposed to atrocity on a regular basis. What happens when you know this is happening, your own governments are doing it, your own media classes are justifying it? That guilt is even more deep and devastating. And that is what really, literally, millions, if not billions of people have felt over the last 2 years or so. So this is also something really, truly unprecedented in human history, that sort of sense of belonging to an international community and yet feeling utterly powerless to change the way that community works.
Bueno, como sabe, aquí en España nuestros políticos están debatiendo, algunos todavía, si hay que usar la palabra genocidio, lo cual me resulta, increíble.
Well, I think there are tiny, shrinking minorities of such atrocity denialists in practically every country. But I think the numbers are dwindling. They're going down all the time, and I think they're becoming more and more desperate as the evidence of the genocide piles up, and it comes from different sources. One day it's coming from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty. The other day is coming from International Organization of Genocide Scholars. Some other day it's coming from Independent Commission of Inquiry by the United Nations. So I think faced with this kind of evidence, people are obviously trying to even be more emphatic in their denial. But I think, in a way, because of the enormous amount of guilt, as I mentioned, and the kind of moral passion to change the situation that has been aroused, those people might find, the people who are denying this, that there is a political price to pay for this denial. And I think it will become quite clear over the next few months.
Ha mencionado usted la palabra holocausto, la Shoah, que se repite mucho en su libro. Podemos decir que el holocausto estableció el rasero del mal que es capaz de cometer el ser humano, ¿no? Y sobre todo demostró cómo se pueden pervertir o adormecer las conciencias de tantísimas personas. Por su mala conciencia, precisamente, las clases dominantes de Occidente han intentado siempre aislar aislar a Israel de toda crítica?
Have they always protected Israel from criticism?
I think, in the beginning at least, the sense of guilt was strong. The idea that, the Jewish minority of Europe was destroyed by not just Germany, but by various other collaborators. Almost every major European country produced collaborators who helped Germany carry out the final solution. And the people who came into positions of power in these countries after the war felt that they had an obligation to the state of Israel. Also because if you remember, and I think it's really important to remember these things, that the United States and also the United Kingdom, they did not want to accept Jewish refugees, even after the Holocaust. And I think I say all these things in my book because I also want to emphasize that this failure of conscience, this failure of compassion, is not something specific to this era. This has happened over and over again, and we need to understand why this happens. We need to really explore why we become, if not actually complicit in acts of mass extermination, how we become indifferent bystanders to these atrocities. And I think, this is something that happened during the Holocaust and afterwards. People knew what was going on in Germany. They turned away from it. And then afterwards, there was a sense like, okay, we can discharge some of our guilt by supporting the state of Israel, by giving it weapons, by giving it arms. But I think something else happened after 1960s, during the Cold War, when Israel became or was seen increasingly as an ally of Western powers against communism, against the pro-Soviet Arab regimes in the area. So Israel became a kind of military outpost increasingly of Western countries, most importantly the United States. So the relationship took on a very different complexion altogether. And then, of course, you had very powerful corporate interests in the United States invested in Israel, and then at the same time invested in keeping the political class in the United States, whether Democratic or Republican, invested in protecting and defending Israel, come what may. I mean, that has reached now, of course, as I said, a monstrous culmination where the ruling class in the US, whether Democratic or Republican, can destroy their own institutions, their own principles of free speech in order to crack down on people protesting against Israel. So the stranglehold of these various corporate Zionist lobby groups has reached a point where the United States right now is engaged in an act of self-mutilation in order to protect this small country in the Middle East. So we are looking at a political pathology, again, quite unprecedented, quite extraordinary. There were people in the Soviet Union, in China under Mao Zedong, who were far more brutal than what we see today in the United States, far, far more brutal. But one thing they were always interested in was to project an image of national sovereignty, self-respect, and autonomy. The United States has thrown away even that. So I think you can see where this investment in Israel has taken the most powerful country in the world. It's an extraordinary spectacle when you think about it.
La memoria colectiva nunca es inocente. Y hay una frase en su libro maravillosa que dice: los hombres poderosos siempre han hecho que sus masacres parecieran necesarias y correctas. Terrible, pero así es. La masacre y la captura de rehenes del 7 de octubre de 2023 en Israel por parte de Hamás, un acto abominable, fue la mecha que prendió la hoguera en la que ahora arde Oriente Próximo. ¿Es posible que Hamás no previera el alcance de un hecho tan terrible, de un acto tan abominable?
I think there is another question to be asked there. Is it possible that Israel itself did not see just how devastated people were around the world to see what happened on October 7th? How the news, when it started to trickle out from Israel, of families being burnt alive, the extraordinary atrocities that were committed on Israelis on that day, I think shocked people everywhere. The Israelis, had they waited and waited for some of these stories to emerge, I think there would have been very little sympathy, even looking at it from a very strategic Israeli perspective. Simply by not responding vengefully and immediately on that very same day, by waiting, by letting these stories emerge and take space in people's consciousness, I think we might be looking at a very different scenario today. It's the fact that it's not so much that Hamas or the militant Palestinian groups that did not actually calculate. We don't know what their thinking was. We really have very little idea. We can speculate about this. But it's that Israel did not calculate, Israel did not estimate that it could avoid being this pariah country that it is today, totally isolated, having lost all human beings of conscience around the world, that it would have been a completely different place had it responded differently to what happened on October 7th.
Sin duda habría sido distinto, muy diferente, sí es verdad. Hablábamos antes del papel de Estados Unidos. ¿Usted cree que Estados Unidos siempre ha mirado al resto del mundo por encima del hombro, casi con desprecio?
I think that attitude, which is one of condescension, and the expectation that everyone in the world wants to be American. Everyone loves their popular culture. They want to be in New York. They want to wear American T-shirts. They want to eat American fast food. And I think this idea that America is not only militarily the most powerful country in the world, but also culturally the most powerful country in the world, is something deeply internalized by many powerful Americans. Of course, now we are in a different phase altogether. I often call it the phase of de-Americanization. I think the world is in the process of de-Americanization at this stage. It's realizing that American ideologies of the free market, of democracy, of human rights, were not quite what they appear to be. And this is a very bitter lesson for many people. So I think there is a different mood now, which is to reject American attitudes of superiority and condescension. And of course, with Donald Trump...
Trump ha hecho mucho por eso, ¿no? Está haciendo mucho.
Exactly. In the first term, he did a lot of damage. I think in the second term, he has single-handedly destroyed American soft power. I think it would be very difficult for most people around the world to take this country seriously again and to take its institutions seriously again, because even the institutions that were supposedly democratic and autonomous have shown an astonishing degree of cowardice and cravenness before Trump. And these are the same institutions that used to honor dissidents in Czechoslovakia or the Soviet Union and to say, look at these brave people standing up against autocracy, against authoritarianism. Where are the American dissidents today? You have these big institutions, with huge wealth. Look at the endowment of Harvard University, systematically surrendering to Donald Trump. So I think this is, again, another lesson for people who had overestimated these institutions and their intellectual capabilities.
Claro, hay que recordar que Trump es un líder elegido democráticamente.
Absolutely. And, I think won the popular votes quite astonishingly in the last election. So again, this is no aberration, and I think it's too easy again to say that Trump doesn't really represent America or Netanyahu doesn't represent Israel. I think if Trump goes tomorrow, it's very likely he'd be replaced by an even more determined, more organized fanatic.
Ya. Este es otra de las grandes incógnitas o de los enigmas de nuestro tiempo, ¿no? ¿Cómo es posible el auge de tantos populismos en tantos países que de larga tradición democrática, ¿no? Usted dice en el libro que ya no confía, digamos, en su generación, que nosotros ya no tenemos arreglo, pero sí confía en los jóvenes. Y es curioso porque estamos viendo a muchos jóvenes que confían en este tipo de líderes. ¿Cómo podemos resolver esto? ¿Cómo podemos explicarnos esto?
There's definitely a generational divide here. I think for my generation and older people and slightly younger people, I'm in my mid-50s now, we grew up in relatively complacent times. Growing up in India, democratic state, we guaranteed a lot of freedoms. Not perfect by any means, but still, better than a lot of places. We didn't have to struggle for those freedoms. We didn't have to fight for those freedoms. We didn't know dictatorship. We had no idea what dictatorship was. And likewise with many people in Western Europe and the United States, particularly, the United States has no experience of despotism. In Western Europe, after 1945, a generation that grew up with no real stakes in anything, no participation in any struggles. A writer I'm very fond of, Tony Judt, once called this the crappy generation that grew up without any, any sort of investment in any political struggle, who had the best of times. And I think these people have been in positions of power and influence for a long time. These are some of the people who are suppressing evidence about what the Israelis are doing right now. So I think, it's very difficult to expect these people to change in their middle-aged and old age. It's young people who are growing up in very difficult, very troubled times, who are energized by what they see, by a world that they see is clearly falling apart. In front of their eyes, they've known one shock after another, from war on terror, the 9/11 attacks, the financial crisis, Brexit, election of Trump, Gaza, and now the far right surging in the so-called advanced democracies. So I think it's a frightening time for these people. And again, the future is blocked. Again, I keep using the word unprecedented, but what is really the most extraordinary of these unprecedented events is for many people in the West, the future has been cancelled. There's nothing to look forward to in the future apart from things worsening, things getting worse. Things getting better was the big, I would say, gamble of the secular era. That was a replacement for faith in God. If you don't believe in God, at least you can believe in a bettering, improving future. well, that future no longer exists. So this is, for young people, a huge crisis. And so they are much more energized by what is happening today. I think it also has to do with a different political experience. When I come to Spain, I recognize that older people actually are more aware of the dangers of despotism and fascism because they had some experience of, nearly 4 decades of Franco. They have some memory, again, individual memory passed down, or some personal memory of what it was like in Spain back then. Younger people who don't have that awareness are far more vulnerable to the far right and to the fantasies and promises of the far right, which is very different in say, England and other countries, where it's the younger people who are politically more engaged.
Pues qué terrible, ¿no? No hay futuro por el que luchar. Quizás podríamos luchar por la paz, porque la palabra guerra, que era una palabra un poco tabú en nuestros países, no se hablaba de guerra. De hecho, la guerra nunca ha estado presente en la vida de mi generación, ¿no? Pero ahora se emplea constantemente. Europa está ampliando sus presupuestos de defensa, se prepara para la guerra. ¿No sería más inteligente y más lógico que ese 5% se destinara a planes para buscar la paz?
Look, I cannot, not agree with you. But we are in a situation where you have, as President of the United States, a man who openly blackmails other leaders, openly bullies them into buying American weapons. So what is Europe doing now? What are European leaders doing now? Going to Trump, going to these NATO summits, and promising Trump these absurd sums of money which will be spent buying American arms, benefiting the American arms industry, and of course, directly and indirectly, Mr. Trump himself. For this, to justify this, we are told that Putin is about to attack Spain, or Putin is about to attack Poland, or Putin can barely fight Ukraine at this point. So we are told you have to prepare for war, you have to raise your defense budgets, but look at what all this is in service of. The arms industry, those are the only people made happy by this. Look at the careers of these American politicians who are pushing for this. Most of them on the board of major arms manufacturers in California. So we are looking really at this scandal of European leaders miserably slavish before this despot in Washington, D.C., nodding their heads to whatever he tells them to do. Again, I'm grateful to be here because you have in this country a government that is not going along with this kind of cowardice and trying to make, even within the confines of the European Union, trying to create an autonomous space for it to function and to say, what is the need for this kind of expenditure? Why should we commit so many billions of euros to this project?
Remitiéndome a su ensayo La edad de la ira, tenemos todo el derecho del mundo a estar enfadados, pero la ira es una emoción muy destructiva. Conduce casi siempre a tomar decisiones precipitadas o equivocadas.
I think, obviously, anger I would use the word anger against injustice is an emotion that, when carefully handled, can open out into compassion and compassion for the weak, feeling of solidarity with the powerless. And so in that sense, anger is almost essential. If you don't feel upset, outraged by a state of injustice, then obviously, there is something morally wrong, and conscience has gone to sleep. So it's hugely important when that anger is channeled, as it is being now by far right personalities and movements around the world, into hatred of people who are supposed to have made your society less rich, or people who are stealing from the government or stealing from welfare systems and so on. What the far right is doing now in the United Kingdom, basically going from pointing to immigrants or asylum seekers to basically pointing to people who've been there for 5 or 6 decades and saying, what are you doing in my country? So this kind of anger, we saw some of that in this big far-right march in London, which was really a shocking event for many people who've been there for 60, 70 years, to suddenly realize that anger in that country over inequality, over inefficient public services, has reached a point where politicians can simply point to some dark-skinned people and say, these are the people responsible for your failure to get a job, for your failure to receive proper health care. When you realize it's the very same people, those dark-skinned people, who are actually working in the medical, in those hospitals, in the health services. And there is no politician at this point in the so-called center-left party willing to stand up and point this basic fact out, that without these people that you want out of the country, the existing system will collapse. And so you need these people there. But they won't make that argument. They would rather channel that anger and rage, which is extremely well grounded. This rage over inequality, this rage over, faltering economies that are meant to benefit the rich, is profoundly grounded. It's not at all irrational. But it's just a matter of what do you do with it? Where do you take that?
¿Cómo la canalizamos? Claro. ¿Cómo la canalizamos? Usted utiliza siempre un concepto que es la guerra civil global. ¿Usted cree que acabaremos en una guerra racial sin remedio?
Well, I don't know whether we'll have we'll end up with that. I hope not, a racial war. But I think the naked appeal to white supremacism that you now see in the United States and also in parts of Europe, that the white race is superior, and we should assert that superiority at every level. So we cannot even have a museum devoted to slavery, because as Donald Trump put it, it will, say that slavery was all bad. There were really no good things about slavery. So you're looking at really an extraordinary shift in political sentiment. You saw this spectacle of the far-right influencer who was assassinated, and then the way in which people were forced, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, forced to pay homage to the man who was basically saying black women don't have the brain power to process a lot of things. There are just a list of things he said, which are deeply, deeply shocking and worrying. But nevertheless, the European Parliament was asked to observe. You had European leaders, Meloni, Orban, paying tribute to him. So I think we are looking at a legitimation of white supremacism across the West. And this is obviously a sign of profound panic, because it's very clear that the rise of China as a major economic power, as a leader in green technology, as a leader now increasingly in artificial intelligence, has profoundly disconcerted this minority in the United States in particular, and forced it to resort to this kind of appeal, which is basically saying these dark-skinned people or yellow-skinned people are about to take over the world. If you don't unite, we will be their slaves. This is the level of the discourse now. So I don't know, the next step is war. War against China remains a live possibility, of course, because Americans have invested in that possibility over a very long period. Confrontation, military confrontation with China. And I think that can happen. We are looking at new configurations in the Middle East now, with Arab countries realizing that the idea of being friends with Israel has to be abandoned. And so we need to all come together. Saudi Arabia just signed a security agreement with Pakistan, the only Muslim country with nuclear weapons. What does that say? What does that say? This is a country, Saudi Arabia, that was closest to Israel all these years, and now signing a pact with Pakistan. So I think things are moving dramatically around the world. We need to be very alert to what is happening, and perhaps through our alertness and through our ability to write and report honestly about these things, we would be able to do something at least to avoid this horrific prospect of a global racial war.
Bueno, tenemos muy poquito tiempo ya, pero ahora que habla de escribir y hablar sobre este asunto, usted menciona la responsabilidad de los medios y los critica abiertamente. ¿Por qué cree que los principales medios de comunicación occidentales no están a la altura de la situación?
I think we'll need another session to discuss that fully. I think the short answer is that journalists have become, or let themselves become, too close to power. Not just to political power, but also to corporate power, financial power.
Bueno, y los que no se acercan al poder son barridos por el poder, como hemos visto ahora en Estados Unidos, ¿eh?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a kind of fascination with power and wealth that even if it doesn't make them corrupt personally, it distorts their judgment. And I think this has happened a lot in the last 2 or 3 decades. I think 90s, globalization, and the promise of globalization that everyone will be rich. That at some level also infected people whose job it was to report on the world and remain aloof from the temptations of power and wealth. The people we admire today, whether it's George Orwell or I can name any number of people, the great writers of the past, whether it's Tolstoy or they always made it a point of remaining aloof from powerful people and maintaining an autonomous, independent position, because they realize that any kind of proximity to power and wealth would corrupt their talent. And I think that basic awareness has been lost. And there are other reasons, of course, the corporatization of many of these big newspapers, like the New York Times, which, whether you like it or not, puts you in proximity with financial power, with political power, and a certain kind of thinking about the world. But I think it's certainly true to say that the mainstream media in much of Western Europe, and definitely the United States, is in a very severe state of crisis right now.
Bueno, yo le recomiendo la lectura de este libro, El mundo después de Gaza, de Pankaj Mishra. Voy a acabar leyendo un párrafo de este libro que dice: la guerra acabará desvaneciéndose con el tiempo, pero las marcas de tanta calamidad permanecerán durante décadas en Gaza. Y aquellos que observaron desde lejos, de brazos cruzados, la muerte y la mutilación de decenas de miles de personas y que fueron testigos del aplauso o de la indiferencia de los poderosos, vivirán con una herida dentro y con un trauma que no desaparecerá en mucho tiempo. Espero que nosotros no formemos parte de ellos. Pankaj, muchísimas gracias por habernos acompañado. Gracias al Festival de las Ideas por esta invitación y a todas las personas que trabajan en lo técnico y en lo administrativo para hacerlo posible. Y, por supuesto, a todos ustedes por haber estado esta tarde aquí. Gracias.